Gabriel's a sociologist, two sociologists in a row, I guess. Political sociologist of development and environmental governance, who's interested in how states and civil society can change natural resource use. As you'll see, his research is about land policy, politics, and deforestation in Amazonia. And I'll let him tell you about the extensive field work that has gone into this project. He earned his bachelor's degree at the University of Sao Paulo in international relations, then a master's
So Amazonia is a global climate tipping point. It's one of the top 5 global climate tipping points, meaning it's very close to being tipped over. It regulates atmospheric temperatures, keeps the atmosphere cooler by about 0.5 degree. It provides rainfall to most of the southern cone and sometimes to the Sahara. It makes temperatures in Europe way more amenable because of its integration with the AMOC system. It contains about 10% of biodiversity on Earth. It also is home for more than 40 million people. So it's a widely inhabited global climate tipping point, and it's you'll hardly find a tree canopy that is not affected directly by human action in this immense basin. The people who inhabit there, indigenous people, traditional communities, farmers, and 80% of them urban dwellers. They're not always in agreement with each other, and they're often struggling for the future of this region. And although ethnic cleavages are very important to these struggles, a lot of the dynamics and the fighting happens also within ethnic groups. So I'm going to talk, and within communities, I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So deforestation has varied a lot in the Amazon, and that is the major driver of this global climate tipping point, and is led mainly by humans cutting down forests. Now, this is a graph of a bar chart of different rates of deforestation from 1988 until last year. And you can see with the bar on the bottom, there are certain patterns that follow national governments. It was very high until 2004, and then under Lula's first government, it dropped drastically, and across to his successor over the next 10 years, it dropped by about 80%. And then it started to increase back again and sort of exploded percentage-wise under the Bolsonaro government and has come back down since. So national policies play a major role in these peaks and valleys, and so do commodity cycles. Nonetheless, there has always been persistent deforestation across governments and commodity cycles, and some of the drivers of that are also what help explain the policy changes in the first place. So over this talk, I'm going to address why deforestation persists despite national policies, how that happens, and under what conditions some policy interventions can work to stop deforestation. So my research methods draw on over a decade of ethnographic fieldwork with communities and inside bureaucracies from starting in 2011 up until 2022. A lot of collaborative territorial mapping experiences within the new social cartography of the Amazon project. And since then, during my PhD, subnational comparisons of neighboring jurisdictions with similar or identical institutional structures, and yet they produce widely different results. And I applied to all this qualitative and administrative quantitative data. I apply some process tracing and other analyses. And what I'll present today draws on two papers that I'm working on, and it is my first attempt to bridge them in a narrative arc that perhaps will inform my book. Let's see if it works, and I would love to hear your feedback on whether this narrative arc works. So, starting off, as a researcher in the new social cartography of the Amazon project, I lived for 6 months in this riverine village, a population about 800. And from there, I branched off to dynamics that were surrounding this village and other villages, and kept on revisiting this place for a long time. I accompanied community gatherings, all sorts of rituals, political rallies, people's work on how they did their fishing, how they hunted, etc., etc. And it was one of the great joys in my professional life, and also a big honor to contribute to countering narratives depicted in this map. That community, called Pimental here, was slated to be flooded by a huge hydroelectric dam. And this is the corporate depiction of that territory in very simplified terms of hydraulic resources, basically, and the community being a simple dot on a territory, which is part of a greater depiction of the Amazon as an empty space, amenable for all sorts of interventions. And I helped them to create a social cartography, which shows the social use of natural resources in their territories. And we came up with, over many months and years of mutual work and collaboration, we came up with this map that countered that empty space of hydraulic resource and narrative. So this was a foundational experience from which I built, and around this area designated to be flooded, I started to see some very disturbing patterns of dispossession. Communities, entire peasant communities being dispossessed, their houses burned down and cut down to make way for larger ranches by grabbers, land grabbers that would come in and expel people forcibly, violently, destroy their homes, and tear down the forest behind them. And I witnessed this on, and in different areas. That was in Pará state. This is the inverse process of a community reclaiming their land after being expelled, organizing themselves, breaking through the gates or what they had been fenced off from, organizing in a march accompanied by politicians, media, and reclaiming their land, only to discover as well their houses destroyed and more forests taken down. Now, communities also fight back, and they would make claims on the state to defend their rights to homestead, to livelihood, and to standing forest. And in particular, to this agency here called INCRA, which I'll come back to throughout my talk. And this is the same community occupying this INCRA office and demanding that the state does something to reassure their repossession of their territory. Now, these on-the-ground dynamics that I witnessed were part of a much larger regional history, which really started gathering force from 1970 onwards, which is of road building to occupy the Amazon area, precisely by creating large farms and colonization projects. And you can see that the existing deforesting axes of today very much follow these roads. And now this is a road plan from 1971, from this Plan for National Integration, and it kind of mimics the US Highway Act Plan of integration done some 50 years earlier. These are these policies that travel in different places, and along these roads, the government designated land for colonization, creating these settlements in this kind of grid-like pattern to put homesteaders in each little plot. Now, that didn't work too well, and it created massive conflicts, massive deforestation. And so in reaction to that, new policies were enacted in 1988, but really gathered force in the 1990s and 2000s of creating a shield from this agrarian frontier. And so in light green here, indigenous lands, dark green, conservation units, and yellow, more settlement projects of mixed use for smallholders to occupy and live there, but also live along with the forest in different types of collective property regimes. Now, a problem is that all along, these different types of land designations really rely on a land title, on communities or individuals owning land with an official piece of paper given by the government that gives them the title deed. And with that, they can go to the bank, get mortgage credit, access different benefits, and eventually, nowadays, apply for carbon credits or so forth. And without these land titles, you have all these downstream services that you cannot access. And so communities and people have to, they have a hard time making a living and resort to illicit economies of further land grabbing, not least because land around them doesn't have titles anyway. Cattle, which is an easy way to occupy land and make some money, logging, gold, and of course, lots of deforestation. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how deforestation happens. And this is based on this working paper of mine called Predatory Growth Machines. And for this, I'll take you to some parts of the some deforestation hotspots. And first, Apuí, which, if you can see my mouse here, is this municipality. It was the #1 deforested municipality in 2022. And this is a general plan of the municipality. It has protected areas in green and the settlement projects in yellow right here. And I spent some time with folks there in the settlement, and I'm going to tell you a story of Joel and Luisa. It was a couple who migrated from northeastern Brazil. They were landless, and after traveling weeks and spending different seasons in different spots, they finally found land for themselves in this settlement in the late 90s. They went back home, brought their entire family, siblings. They settled along this little road, which they built themselves. And they tried several different things. They tried agriculture. They couldn't sell their produce. They tried coffee. They made amazing coffee, but it was very hard to ship the coffee to faraway markets. And so they finally settled on cattle, which has more policy support and it's easy to manage, demands little labor. The infrastructure is also easy to sell milk, to sell the beef itself, to sell calves that you can ship far away. And they tried Red Plus programs throughout the years, and they never saw a single dime from them until 2022, at least. Joel campaigned to be a city council member for this municipality several times, almost made it, but never quite did. He was an opposition player to the local rural workers union who sided with the bigger ranchers. And as his family grew, they helped to get more people and his family to create a new road down the street from his and settle more families, edging closer and closer to this national park. Now, he found a guy called Mato Grosso who was illegally occupying that area and said, I sold this off, so you cannot come here and open this area. They had a tussle. He got shot at, they shot his motorbikes, everybody fled into the forest. He had to wait days in the forest and then fled to the capital city where he spent 2 months. And then he came back after things had settled. He gave up settling these new families there, and Mato Grosso sold off the land and hired, he was a broker who hired laborers to deforest for the buyer, the person who had bought the land. And I asked Joe, like, how come you're back? Like, they might kill him. He's like, no, his deal is done, and I have too many friends in this area. So if he kills me, he's gonna get killed as well. So we're even. This is to illustrate the context for the economics of deforestation. Flipping forests, much like flipping houses in a city, is very profitable. A forested area, a hectare in Apuí in 2022 was costing about $500 per hectare. Deforesting it costs quite a bit of money too. My calculus was $164. But after you turn it to pasture, it's worth 10 times the price. And so your returns on investments are enormous. You'll be hard pressed to find such high returns on investment. And deforestation labor for skilled deforesters is a very good wage. $80 a day, which is basically, there's no competition for that in the Amazon. You have to be an engineer or something to make an equivalent wage. So in Apuí, which saw 74,000 hectares deforested in 2022, my estimate says that required at least $9 million of investments, and you need quite a bit of money, $100,000 to clear 1,000 acres, which is about 2,400 hectares, the other way around. And that's considered a medium-sized farm in this area. Now, the land use income also has quite a bit of variability. A forested plot of land demands a lot of labor to get produce from it. Those produces are seasonable, and they might not have a market, might be very difficult to ship them elsewhere, and so it's quite uncertain. Now, carbon credits, for those who are able to secure it, were about $20 per hectare year. Now, from pasture and cattle, you get at least $70, surely. And if it's good enough for soy, you can get up to $2,000 from it. Now, acai, which you may have tried, is a forest-based product, but it can also become a monoculture plantation. And I've seen some of those. It also provides good income, but demands a lot of labor. So deforestation is at once a speculative asset, a real estate operation, a labor market, and a capital investment for a booming cattle and soy economy. Now, this you probably knew. It's kind of well known. It pays to deforest. It pays to produce things on deforested land. And so in these places, in these frontiers, it's very tentative to engage in logging cattle, land markets, gold mining. And so you invest in that, people get wages, and that produces deforestation. Now, I'm going to talk about a parallel dynamic here. These same towns saw quite a bit of support for Bolsonaro, who at the time in 2022 was in government, trying re-election, and was very much against environmental policies and had given a free-for-all, basically, for deforestators, land grabbers, gold miners, and so forth. Now, these towns at the edge of the forest saw a booming economy, shiny new businesses, people advertising airplane-based seating, very expensive stuff, and kind of fervent support for Bolsonaro. I saw so many people saying, yes, he's our last hope, we must support. And they're just, in most of these places, so immersed in it that they couldn't imagine Bolsonaro losing. Now, this is not Apuí, it's the next city over. This is the burnt down office of the environmental agents, which the mayor himself in 2017 led a protest of gold miners, and they burnt down the federal government building, and it was never rebuilt. They're supposed to be rebuilding this year, but I'm not sure. So for at least 9 years, they haven't had this environmental agency present in the territory. And it makes environmental operations very difficult because to do them, they travel from another city through the road. Everybody sees the big cars coming. They call each other, radio, and everybody who's doing illegal stuff just goes into the forest for a week or two and goes back to what they were doing before. I'm also going to talk about a few other political processes parallel to these actions against environmental agencies. So here in a riverine community, Elena was a famous activist against the hydroelectric dam and for land rights and other things. And I went one day to interview her, and we were about to start, and her husband said, sorry, you can't give an interview. And she was very upset. Well, how come I can't do an interview? And he's like, well, he explained to me, and they had a fight in front of me. Their community hadn't had garbage picked up for 2 months. And he managed to become the mayor appointee to be the caretaker locally. And so he was getting a wage, and the mayor had restored the trash collection services, premised upon there being no activism. So the mayor told him, you gotta quiet that thing down. And he did. He quieted his wife down. She did not proceed with the interview. And they had trash collection for a while. Now, another story of Ronaldo. These are all pseudonyms, of course. Ronaldo ran for council member. It's from a small riverine community, and he lost by 7 votes. I don't know if you can imagine how infuriating it can be if you're running for office and you lose by 7 votes. And so I interviewed him, and a few days after his loss, he's just learning about his loss right there. And he said, well, next time I'm gonna win. How do you know you're gonna win? Well, I sold my pass. I met Goiano, and I sold my pass. And what do you mean you sold your pass? Oh, like a soccer player. I'm still puzzled, and he's like, I sold my past like a soccer player. Whatever candidate for Congress member or governor who wants votes from my community and is gonna come through me needs to talk to Goiano first to see what he wants, and then I allow him to come in. And in exchange, Goiano, the owner of the single large supermarket in town, is gonna finance my illicit political campaign, basically. So he would get money to buy out votes or give out favors, get people cars to go to the hospital, pay for hospital bills, get them to do a funeral service for their family members in the municipal cemetery, and so forth. Basic public services require this type of political brokery. And on the election that Ronaldo lost, Saulo won, his opponent. Now, Saulo was also, had been an activist defending his community rights, and through this type of political brokering, won election. Also with the support of Goiano. This is a year and a half after Ronaldo said he would get Goiano support. Here is Saulo embracing Goiano. And Goiano is the owner of this warehouse they're in, for instance, and they're meeting with Congress members, candidates for different offices, and uniting different rural communities in there. And Goiano's discourse was like, we got to support these people to kick out the NGOs and block environmentalists from coming in here. And everybody got reelected here. And so you see how these frontier entrepreneurs kind of capture local government through running for office and creating this sort of intermediation for basic services. And they acquire support, and people sometimes are satisfied by the political brokerage that they can get. Otherwise, they get nothing. You don't have an ambulance to take you to the hospital, and so forth. So these predatory growth machines, they limit resistance and foreclose different types of alternatives for local communities. So these frontier entrepreneurs, they oppose environmental policy formally and informally. They sabotage policies from within by leaking operations when they're happening, or for instance, buying out hotel rooms in small towns when the police, federal police is coming, so they don't have anywhere to stay and they have to move on to the next town on the same day. They mobilize contentious action against environmental agencies and NGOs and so forth. They coerce environmental defenders who are staunch opposers of encroaching ranches and so forth. And they preempt and foreclose environmental economic alternatives by the deforesting work itself. After you deforest, it's very hard to make a living from the forest products or produce, and you have to wait years, decades, sometimes for the forest to regrow. And so these frontier entrepreneurs translate economic capital into political capital and also cultural capital by promoting this sort of cowboy culture in these localities, in which rodeos become the most important event in the town's year. And so this is a more complete picture of how deforestation works on the ground. There's a clear economic pathway, which was not a mystery, and an indirect political pathway, which came to me over time, over iterative observations of what local leaders did, how they dealt with local communities, and so forth. And again, the deforestation makes it harder for people to lead ecological alternatives, and it also dispossesses communities and makes it harder for them to acquire good economic standing stable institutions and so forth. So I very quickly, I contrast these predatory or build on the traditional growth machine concept, which is an alliance between entrepreneurs and politicians in American cities that produce urban sprawl. And they're based on basically the hegemony of middle classes and the idea of growth will get our land, our property, our houses are going to be more valuable. So let's take on this urban sprawl. And these predatory growth machines in context of resource frontiers appeal to all sorts of tactics, clientelism, policy sabotage, and contentious action to suppress alternatives. And so sure, there's national policy that that changes deforestation rates, but it basically activates these existing predatory growth machines on the ground and are enticed by them and get their support. And so you have a certain number of events that coordinate throughout these localized predatory growth machines. And one big example of that was in 2019. There was a coordinated arson throughout the Amazon region for people to demonstrate that they did support Bolsonaro's stance on anti-environmental policy. And it happened throughout. And after Lula came into office, again, it happened in early 2023 and 24. Now, the other side of this coin, which is policy implementation and this governance of land to as one mechanism to stop deforestation. And I treat it as one way in which conservation can work. So I mentioned there's widespread lack of land titling, even though it's part of the policy. So people are supposed to get land titles for the settlements in which they live. And land titles provide this official recognition of property rights to, not in the abstract, but to a particular person or group of people. And that provides a layer of juridical protection for that person's or people's tenure in that land. It also enables access to credit, extension services, and nowadays carbon markets. Without land titles, you get a whole bunch of flimsy carbon credits. You might lose assets. People are very skeptical of the market to begin with. So this is a huge bottleneck also for carbon credits based on forests. And so I argue that it's, or a lot of people argue that it's land titles are a necessary but insufficient condition for halting deforestation and land grabs. And now there are studies showing that titled land sees way less deforestation than untitled land. And here's Pacheco and Meyer's representation of those findings. And land titles are also arguably by Nobel Prize winners, Acemoglu and Robinson, and famously argued by Hernando de Soto, smallholders getting property rights enables development in general. Now, my question is how, under what conditions can people get property titles to begin with? The policy is enacted, it's on paper, are they going to get it? So it's a question of implementation. Now, INCRA, that agency that takes care of land federally in Brazil, has a formal mandate to give property rights to people, has meritocratic recruitment through exams, career tenure for its employees and technical staff, but it's highly under-resourced, underfunded, understaffed, and highly overstretched. So in 1985, they took care of 67 settlement projects. Nowadays, it's almost 10,000. In the meantime, their staff dropped by 1/3, and their budget just in 20 years shrank to 10% of what it was. So they're extremely spread out, extremely thin. And so with these under-resourced bureaucracies operating in contentious fields, what explains effective titling? Now, the neat thing for a study with INCRA is that it has all these subnational jurisdictions. So it's a uniform agency, but it has regional offices that are amenable to the influence of local civil society. And they perform very differently for titling. Here are their different titling rates within the Amazon region, and you can see it goes from almost everybody or more than everybody titled to just 20% of smallholders titled. And I studied two of the bigger jurisdictions. The first is this one in red, where less than 20% of smallholders got their property titles, and it's this Western Pará region. And the other one, it's its next door neighbor, Amazonas. And together they hold 1/3 of the Amazon rainforest. And what explains, it's the same agency, they're neighbors, they share many common social traits. What explains this discrepancy? And it's actually a puzzle of an inverted outcome, because Western Pará, the worst performer, was actually the policy priority region by national plans. There was a broad coalition of social and political players that supported press for titling. And so we expected high performance. And the inverse was the case in Amazonas, where no priority, people didn't care much about titles. There was not this political salience. And we expected then from an under-resourced agency that they would just get by and perform badly. But the opposite happened, and it has to do with some intervening mechanisms. So in Western Pará, land had very high rents relative to other activities. Industries or economic activity was focused on agricultural land or land speculation. And also the elites were fragmented. The political elites were numerous, not aligned. And with high rents, they were frequently trying to intervene in the INCRA office. And what happened was a hyper subordination of this federal agency within Western Pará, and people were clients, smallholders would engage with hostility to the agency as well. Some rural workers leader told me them creating this agency was the worst plague that had ever hit them. And so this sort of constant, frequent intervention produced a very high turnover in superintendents, 17 different superintendents over the course of 17 years in this agency. And that produced all sorts of organizational corrosions, administrative disarray. Bureaucrats got polarized internally, would fight each other, would threaten each other. Some of them were aligned to different societal forces and accused each other of corruption or of being just using legal resistance for nothing. And there were even death threats between bureaucrats. A lot of them left, abandoned their careers, and the office was unable to outsource many of its tasks, and leaving untapped a lot of non-state capacity to undertake some tasks. And so that led to failed titling, and settlements were drifting, meaning smallholders had no recourse, no help from this federal agency. They were left on their own, fending for themselves, getting expelled, encroached upon by loggers and so forth. On the other hand, in Amazonas, the non-priority region with little support for land titling, but which was effective at titling, what happened was land, especially land held by this agency, had little rent value because of prior government policy that heavily invested in industrial activities in the capital city, Manaus. a place I happen to live. What happened was a rural exodus, people migrating to the main city and leaving plots fallow. Several landowners of prior rubber economy eras just abandoned their very large land holdings, abandoned their land holdings and invested in commercial industrial activities in the capital city. And so they didn't care much about what happened with rural land. And so there was this elite forbearance or allowing INCRA to do basically whatever it wanted. And so with that, INCRA had very stable leadership in this agency, in this jurisdiction, and they were able to collaborate with smallholders, with clients. That produced a lot of organizational stability. People kept their jobs. They learned from each other within the organization. They got acquired specialized skills, and they used their moderate partisanship, meaning they were ideologically aligned with certain ideals, but they were able to act on this and create alliances with smallholders and sort of outsource although they're stretched very thin in a humongous territory. They were able to outsource their tasks to the smallholders themselves, like identify where people live, gather the documents, survey the plots, lead me to these places for free. And people did that. And so this civil society capacity was able to shoulder these bureaucratic tasks and enable this under-resourced organization to work and to give out titles to these communities. A majority of smallholders in this place got titles. So yeah, how can, in places of resource frontiers where bureaucracies are underfunded generally, how can they be effective? How can they provide policies, implement policies that will enable, amongst other things, conservation? Part of the argument, and that comes from my findings, is that these bureaucracies need to be sheltered from these frontier elites. And you might, if they're uninterested in the land bureaucracy, all the better, but they don't have to be aligned with the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy needs to be sheltered from these elites. Now, collaboration by clients is super important. And when clients protest rather than collaborate with these agencies, and very rightfully so, very justifiably so, but it creates these internal organizational effects of bureaucrats not being able to do their jobs, and sometimes catering for particular protests, but overall creating more work, more administrative disarray. And bureaucrats, with their partisanship, can collaborate with these civil society agents in a pragmatic culture, and can outsource tasks to them and supplement their lack of capacity with civil society's capacity. Now, to close, what do these papers together suggest for policy implications? Well, one is that you really need to strengthen local governments and public service delivery in Amazonia to kind of protect communities from predatory frontier elites, and reduce rents and bureaucracies is another way, like reorienting elite interests to other economic activities. But that is very difficult to do, because for some of these predatory elites, that's all they know. They know how to cut down trees. They know how to deal with squatters, but they don't necessarily know how to invest in real estate, urban development, for instance. So there's a stickiness to these challenges. Within these agencies, I think you really need some tenure mandates, like a minimal amount of time that these people, agency leaders should hold office unless they do some improper administrative measure. And from the point of view of NGOs or public prosecutors, it's important to avoid litigating against public agencies themselves. I missed this point in my case, which litigation further adds fray to fragile institutions that must respond to these judicial proceedings, and sometimes will let the situation on the ground get even worse. And that definitely happened in Western Pará. So litigation against public agencies propel institutional erosions when these agencies are under-resourced to begin with. And rather, instead, I suggest targeting economic sectors and extractive actors for litigation. And another point is that I think is important is fostering cooperative relationships between bureaucrats and smallholding communities to co-produce policies and compensate for resource constraints. And I think this is a growing challenge worldwide, with bureaucracies having their mandates expanding, especially with climate change. They have to deal with benefits for people under changing conditions. Their budgets are shrinking, and in places even in the US, you get DOGE cutting down on so many services and agencies, and you might see some similar dynamics playing out here as well. So I guess that's it. And thank you very much. And you can access a couple of papers on my website. Guess I'll take questions.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Well, thank you, Gabriel, for that presentation. It was fascinating. And I wanted to ask you about the community participatory mapping that you described at the beginning. That's one of the methods that I forget to be using in my own field work, and I'm curious to hear how you do it. Who gets to participate in the drafting of the map? And do you produce one single map that is meant to represent the unanimous view of the community as to what their territory looks like? Or the way I do it, producing different maps with different stakeholders, maybe highlighting different resources or different geographical cultural features, for instance. How do you do it?
Well, the project I worked on or worked in for as a researcher for 3 years does it in different ways. But there's no single formula, and it's really driven by local communities or social movements themselves. Now, of course, there will be differences within these communities, and in general, you try to address them and have people split up, do different drafts, reunite, talk, discuss things. But in general, they're not trying to create a single plot of land that would become the official property right. It's sort of depicting the social use of a territory, and that can be multiple, have different layers and different people using different things. So there's no one answer to it. And this is a project that integrates 20 different public universities in Brazil. So it has dozens of researchers, and it has produced hundreds of maps by now. So it might be reaching the 1,000 already. So there isn't one methodology that is followed by everyone.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Gabriel. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I learned so much today. Two questions. One is related to carbon credits. I mean, clearly, like the math you've shown, right? Carbon credits pay very little compared to, you know, cattle ranching, which is sort of surprising, I think, given how much within climate finance, there's been a talk on, you know, Amazon forests and carbon credits. And also, I mean, there were instances of green grabbing, right, where literally people would kick off indigenous people just, you know, to use that land for green offsets. So I wanted to ask you if you've seen sort of this dynamic, perhaps, you know, how did that change? And my second question is on climate finance. Have you seen sort of an uptick or any really meaningful, you know, impact that climate finance funds and all these types of, you know, green investment vehicles, have you come across, did you feel like they were important or relevant?
Well, in this context that I mentioned, carbon credits, I put an asterisk. They weren't credits per se, they were a government program instituted prior to the creation of a national carbon market in Brazil, which passed 2 years ago. So that was not the result of this instituted carbon market. It was rather like an income distribution for people who kept their forests standing. So it wasn't traded as carbon as such, but people were speculating on carbon and trying to enclose areas for themselves to in the future make some money out of carbon credits. Now, at the time, by 2022, I don't think people in the places I visited, they weren't too concerned because they thought there had been so many programs and schemes trying to get this, and they all kind of failed and they didn't see any money from it. So it was kind of like business as usual. With the national regulation for carbon markets, it might start to change a little bit, but it all depends on getting the property rights first. And that hasn't changed much, but there are these attempts at green grabbing that use similar legal or illegal mechanisms, but don't clear the forest. There have been also many communities that regretted signing commitments to not use their forest and so forth. And as for climate finance, I think there's a lot happening and it's quite recent. And some of it sounds exciting and on the right path. And it's on the very beginning. And when I see the presentations by the people, they're, oh yeah, and we got this fund and now we're funding 10 farmers in this fund. 10 farmers, like that's nothing. Like you see all this propaganda all over, like, wow, maybe we have a chance. And if you analyze their program, what they're doing with the farmers, the couple of famous cases that I've looked into, they're basically trying to do the same thing the state tried 50 years ago, but on private credit. Like, yeah, we'll give you money, you try to do this, try to do slightly different things, agroforestry. But if you don't pay, we're gonna take it back. We're gonna have to take it back somehow. And that's what happened in this whole history of Amazon colonization, is basically that. So there's a lot of continuity and great challenges. Yeah, Carmen.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I particularly appreciated your policy implication about targeting economic sectors and extractive actors. And forgive if I'm misunderstanding the frontier entrepreneurs, but how disconnected or interconnected are these frontier entrepreneurs to companies like JBS that are in Brazil that are, have been litigated in the US to some extent, but are they intertwined with these like pretty large multinational corporations, or are they distinct? Sort of how is that mapped?
There's at least one degree of separation between the big corporations and the evilest of actors, sometimes 2 degrees of separation. The cattle market, for instance, how it works is in these recently deforested areas, they'll have calves, put calves. Once the calves are a year old or so, they sell it to a fattening farm. Now, that sale involves a transportation, which might take days. So the calves, they stay 5-6 days without eating. They get to the fattening farm, they're very skinny, and then they stay another year there. They grow, and then they're sold from the nice, shining fattening farm to JBS and so forth. And it's that first link that is very hard to get at. There are many attempts. People are trying to, Pará, one of the jurisdictions, is creating tagging calves, but calves are not born with tags. So I'm sure, some people are gonna find ways to put a tag on a calf that is grown in illegally deforested areas. So yeah, I think in the case of soy, there was a soy moratorium for more than 10 years. It got canceled last month, sadly, but it was some of these big corporations saying we will not buy soy from farms that deforested after 2005. And now that created a whole bunch of challenges because you can't even put the same soy on the same silo. So you have a port with a silo and the illegal soy can't, and they were able to create a political movement to liquidate the soy moratorium, and which is a big risk for the agro sector in Brazil, because Europe might say, well, then you can't have your soy. I'll go with seniority.
I got 2 questions, sorry.
We've only got time for one.
All right. Really interesting, really interesting. Well, the first one might be quick. You kind of glossed over the REDD+ failure program, and I'm really curious because that's been billions of dollars was supposed to have been dumped in from the UN and other multilaterals into sort of, preserving forests for climate emissions, protections, et cetera. And are there any success stories of REDD+?
I'm sure there are some decent successes, and this program that pays out $20 a hectare per year for a family is somewhat of a success, but it's not enticing enough to be a success where it matters, where people see, well, they're making $70 with cattle. What am I waiting for? So it was a lot of these ideas for REDD+ were gestated precisely by NGOs working in these areas. And I think there's a bit of success. I wasn't focused on these REDD+ programs, so I can't give you a precise panorama. But in the places that I was, it was either not cared about at all or dismissed as having failed too many times for them to care about until now.